I'm Aslı Hatipoğlu. I've done my residency at the Jan van Eyck between 2020 and 2021 during the pandemic. I came here with a research question into fermentation and to observe different fermentation practices from different cultures. I was, during my residency here, I was most often going to the wild landscape here to try to understand the relationship the wild bacteria has in comparison with domesticated ones. And I wanted to bring attention to, through the wild fermentation techniques, to bring attention to how our world is changing and how we're becoming more in our production systems indoors, and how we're separating ourselves more from the wild, because the wild landscape is no longer as safe as we think that it is. So by creating a bridge between talking through the wild fermentation techniques to bring attention to basically ecology and our gut microbiome, and therefore a different dialogue that we create between the food that we eat and how our bodies are composed through the things that we ingest. And when I moved here, I was given, or I was cultivating already the kombucha at the house that I was living in, which is was in growing in a domestic environment. So this is the kombucha that has been living with me now 3 years. I have adopted her from my previous house. And basically what it is kombucha, SCOBY stands for symbiotic culture, a symbiotic relationship of culture between yeast and bacteria that forms this cellulose pellicle. Well, it originates, according to my research, which we can also question like to the origins, because a lot of people don't know exactly how it was created. But according to my research, and which also makes somehow sense to me, is that the earlier nomads believed to be originated in Korea had to carry their teas in sacks made out of the cow's stomachs, stitched. So at some point over a period, they would see that the tea started to ferment. And because of the miraculous health properties that they have realized, they continue to brew this tea using the dried stomachs of the cow. So this is the kind of the same process as the fermentation practices related with cheese, for instance, because the cheese is also curdled, coagulated through the enzymatic bacteria, which are coming from the fluids in the baby cow's stomach. So this is to be believed that is what started to create this skin, and the continuation of this fermented tea was basically through people giving to each other and traveling to different spaces. So basically what is in the kombucha SCOBY is different bacteria and yeast that are living, and this is pretty much determined by the spaces that it inhabits. So for instance, they have made a study of different SCOBYs from across the world to see if how they are similar and how they are different. So for instance, if it is growing in a place where beer making, for instance, is also taking place, then the yeast that is responsible for the beer fermentation, which is the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that also ends up in the kombucha SCOBY. So kombucha SCOBY is pretty much determined to the environments that it's been put into. So because I, for instance, deal with bread making, sourdough fermentation at home, I believe that the lactobacillus bacteria that lives in my sourdough also lives in the kombucha, and this is what also sets the taste of the kombucha different from one another. And And when I was at the Jan van Eyck, I started to grow it in an aquarium in my studio. And my main reason of wanting its growth in a bigger container was also because I was curious of how bacteria and yeast communities react in different atmospheric conditions or spaces that they're put into. So when they're displaced from a domestic environment into another space, how do they respond to this new landscape, and how they're changed by the landscape that they're in. One factor that that inspired me in this process was, for instance, the sterility of the studio, or the lies, or maybe possibly the traces of the previous participants that were before me, that was in the space but was not very visible, and how these traces from something that was before me can be reflected upon something that is actually growing there. And the fact that we are next to the music school, I was interested in sound and how this sound also changes the way that the fermentation takes place. And in this process, I also was observing a lot how this SCOBY is formed with different settings. And what I tried to do was first to understand the formation of the kombucha SCOBY itself. So basically how it works is that kombucha needs 3 elements in order to grow, which is carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. The carbon in this case is the sugar, the nitrogen is the tea, and the bacteria basically uses up this nitrogen, which the bacteria is the acetoacer bacteria mainly, that basically use up these elements in order to collaborate with the yeasts that are also coming from the tea in order to, and also living in the SCOBY and to create this relationship. So what the yeast does is that it breaks down the sucrose into glucose, and this glucose is then taken up by the acetoacid bacteria, and it's basically how the relationship works is that acetoacid bacteria stores fat in the cells. It's the same as like when the bears are preparing themselves for the winter, as to in case of that, in order to live basically. So when all the resources are used up, the cellulose microfibrils start to form using the sucrose from the sugar and use up the tea to burst out. So basically biopolymers burst out of the cell walls in order to structure themselves, in order to create this wall. And the reason why they want to build this wall is that when the nutrients are getting used up, it does it in order to protect itself from other competitors that are visible, that are in the air, which is most of the times the pathogenic bacteria, which can be described as the green mold we see on food. It lives in the air, as well as acetic acid bacteria, but acetic acid bacteria can only grow when there is an alcohol in the tea. So first the yeast breaks down the sugar into alcohol, and then the acetic acid bacteria comes in. So there is like a kind of relationship how everything takes place, and so basically they collaborate together in order to form this skin so that it can protect itself from the pathogenic bacteria, which is the things that they don't want to compete with. So it's very interesting. I was very interested in using this as a metaphor in my work to separate this internal and the external environment, and how we like observing myself to these boundaries of protection and vulnerability. Because the tea is vulnerable when it's exposed to the air that it lives in, and the things that you don't see or the things that are influenced are also things how you're building your inner reality of ways of protecting yourself towards the environment that you're put in. So it goes into a bit like psychology and behavioral observation of people as well. And so I like to study deep into my practice and to try to use these metaphors for other things. And so I experimented with different type of teas, like the green tea or the black tea, and to see its formation taking place in different time frames. So here you can see, for instance, how the bacterial cellulose is formed together with in collaboration with the yeast. And I started to also experiment with placing them on different structures to take different forms. And they're very unique because I never managed to produce the same thing twice. Is because the time, the place, and tea is different. Maybe sugar is the same, but yeah, and sugar also does contain some cellulose in it too, because it's dried from the plant. So it is also something that is used up by the yeast and the bacteria together. And what I continued to do with these papers is not to try to make a design or a product with it, because that was not my initial goal in why I started this project, but it was more to observe different dialogues that I could create with myself through this medium. So I started to write letters. Here you can see a letter that I have written on a typewriter, because this was quite also thin. And while I was writing these papers, I also realized that, okay, this because writing has always been a process for me to observe my inner self and the dialogue that I create with myself. And I think it's an amazing medium for healing, for releasing part of yourself, and then using this moment to also self-reflect. But at the same time, I didn't really wanted maybe my letters to be necessarily read by people, but more I was curious to how they could be traced back a couple of years later, but not to exactly find the letter that I wrote, but more like maybe things that are traces of this letter. So I did a couple of different experiments. One of them includes a letter. So I also experimented with a medium where I pressed sheets that had using a photopolymer paper. We made a negative in the photo studio, and we used it to press it on the wet skin in order to get the imprint of the letter on the skin, which you can kind of see better in this. And this is also quite a very thin sheet. So you can, yeah, kind of see the traces of my letter imprinted into the skin. And so, for instance, this one is also sheets that I have printed the letter, but what I've done is that I let it dry, and after a while I rehydrated it and dehydrated it again. And what is remaining is basically just traces of the letter that can be found in different parts of the paper. And I think it's also very interesting to see just parts of a text and try to imagine a different scenario, because you see different words from a different time frame. And I found that very inspiring to see this kind of traces. And after I realized that the skin, after it's been exposed to the air, gets quite dark, like this one, for instance. And you can also see pretty much the different layers of interaction between the yeast and the bacteria. And this is also a letter that I have printed during my residency here, and this, for instance, has been exposed over the last 3 years a lot. It's been showcased a lot. Now it's completely dark. And another one I can show I've made for a work in Amsterdam, and you can see that the letters are also changing with the skin's process of drying and changing form. So it also starts to becoming something else after a while. And I really wanted to let go of this process of trying to control and keep a material as intact as possible, because I really like the ephemerality of nature and change. I have tried to also use a combination of different ways of protecting the paper. I call it the kombucha paper, the SCOBY paper, by making a mix from raisin from the tree that is native to Europe. It's called sandarak, and mixing it with lavender oil. I made a lac to be able to preserve the skin, to also see how the same skin changes over time. So I left, like, for instance, the corners without the varnish. And I've also tried to place it on different structures and to let it dry on that structure to see how it curls up on a structure that it's given. And one more process that I have tried or have seen while I was being busy with this material was to, because after I let it grow, usually it takes about a month to produce a skin that is as thick as this one, which is this, for instance, is the one that is not is not washed several times, so it still contains a bit of the sugar from the tea, and it is as flexible as it is, and you can also see that it's quite stable. It's actually a material that is used in the biomedical fields because its properties, it's stronger than the cellulose, plant cellulose, and also not allergic. So it's used a lot in a lot of different things, such as, I wrote this down, cardiovascular components such as blood vessels, for tissue scaffolding, bone grafts, connective tissue replacement. So it's actually used inside our body as well as outside of what we see. It's used a lot in the cosmetics. At the moment, they're also doing a lot of studies to combine it within the paper making industry. And what makes it stronger is because the plant cellulose has a lot of lignin in it, so that makes it more fragile compared to this bacterial yeast cellulose. So this is as thick as it can become. If you want, even thicker, but I haven't never tried to leave it more than like 2 months. And this is as thin, for instance, as it can get from, I think this is like 2 weeks. So this is when I start to actually also type on them or use them, and it more has a paper structure. This is also washed several times. So when I wash it, I also remove the sugar, so it becomes more, this, yeah, you can also hear from the material. Yeah. And because I was also, at the moment I'm experimenting with different mediums, so my fascination with it, like I'm now traveling with it everywhere. So I'm currently doing advanced performance and scenography studies in Brussels called APAS, and I'm trying to find, I'm actually observing a lot of the relationship between storytelling in combining fiction and reality. because I think that thinking about things in the local context, it has to be redefined what we consider as local. I started to research into beer making, for instance, in Brussels, and I have also heard a lot of stories about the yeast living in the air, and then it ends up in the beer, and that's what it makes the wild fermentation, and so on. But usually the yeast and bacteria, they take up space, so they actually colonize the environment that they're put in, and this is what lives usually most of the times in wood. And when there is a material that's been brought into the place, it starts to inhabit whatever is as a source to eat within the space. In this case, the beer, which is made from malted grains, so the malting process also releases the sugars available for the bacteria and yeast to be able to eat. And so I was thinking a lot about also tourism and originality and resources in general, and this is where I actually start to mix my tea with another material, where I'm exploring the dynamics of a synthesized versus natural material. I don't have a sample yet because I'm in the early exploration of this practice, but I have gone to Turkey to learn this art called Ebru art, which is water marbling technique over the water. And it is basically how it's been made is basically there is a plant that grows in the Anatolian region, which was collected by people, and the liquid that will come out of this plant would be dry. It's like a white liquid, would be dried up and mixed with the water in order to create a very dense liquid solution. And because of this density, which is almost like a bit like jelly, when you like mix agar-agar or carragena, which is also a material that is used these days instead of the actual natural material, it allows the pigments, which are also fermented by the bile juice of the cow that's collected. It's called ox gallbladder fluids, and this is also used a lot, for instance, watercoloring in the watercolors, so that the colors don't go into each other, but they can stay separately alongside each other. And it basically allows the pigment to be able to open up on the surface by creating pressure over the surface of the water when the water is dense with this liquid from the plant. But because this also takes quite a lot of time and space, and also it only, because it's a natural material, it only lasts for, I think, 4 to 5 days. They have started to going more into synthesized products, like, for instance, carragena, which is also used a lot in our food industry, to be able to, especially in vegan things, I have to say, which is a material that basically creates homogeneous fluids, so that, for instance, a salad dressing, the herbs don't mix with the oil, or that stays stable, so it's nicer to see. But also improves the shelf life of our products. And so this natural ingredient from this specific place was replaced by carragena, which is derived from the Red Sea algae. Over time, they have found another method to extract it actually from the plant, which is basically extracting the plant cellulose out of the plants in order to create the same structure, which is called CMC, carboxymethyl cellulose. And I've started to research into this material specifically because it can last for like 2-3 weeks without going bad. And this is what actually also improves the shelf life of a lot of things. And it's used in cosmetic, toothpaste, mayonnaise, gels, creams. So it's a material that is highly used in the industry. But if you ingest it, even just a small bit, it does create a lot of problems within the body. But of course, this is not something that we are told much. Of what you know, if you don't die, it's fine, basically. So I started to imagine, like, okay, if kombucha was what is happening in my stomach, how does this relationship happen with something that is synthesized that goes into this being? So I started to combine kombucha with this cellulose driven from the plants, the CMC, and started to make paintings over the surface by using actually earth pigments that are coming from this region. From Belgian border and the Netherlands, and I started to experiment with trying to create this painting over the surface where it's changed by the bacteria and the cellulose and the actual CMC material, which is the cellulose that's living together with this a live thing that is trying to make the cellulose. So if it's given like the comfortable situation, like getting the cellulose inside the material to stabilize it, which actually stops a lot of mold, for instance, to grow. Like mold sometimes grows on top of the SCOBY because of the exposure to air and not having much movement. But usually because they're so in small amounts compared to the kombucha usually kill, the kombucha yeast and bacteria kill if there is anything that is pathogenic bacteria on it. So if you just press the skin inside the liquid, it will not survive. But in the case of the CMC already preserves the kombucha from it getting moldy. So it's very interesting how they started having a different dialogue with each other and how this SCOBY starts to form because of this input. And what I'm trying to also do is to try to change its atmospheric situation. So I started putting a light box underneath the structure and to try to see how it's changed. If there is more heat that the kombucha gets, how does it start to organize itself? But also through the light box, you can clearly see the movement of the structure of how it starts to build. Yeah. I think what is also fascinating is just because I'm doing different experiments with, but of course, like there's a lot of factors that could be potentially changing how it's formed, and I think this is the exciting part of not having science or like controlling the in a lab, like how it is formed or things, because I'm really interested in the actual landscape and the specific time frame or the specific place that it's been put into, because we can have a lot of theories to how something can react, but we would never exactly know the other factors that might influence this living being. Yeah, like traces on the wall, and I don't know. I'm brewing it also in a place that used to be an old brewery where they bottle the beers. So I was like, maybe there is like beer yeast still living in this building, and how would it then change, for instance, the kombucha, for instance. And what is interesting is that different, like sometimes I put too little kombucha in the actual mixture, whereas sometimes I put quite vinegary kombucha combined with CMC. So I started to also observe how they're different than one another. But I'm still, because it takes quite a lot of long time, I would say that the formation of the SCOBY is much, much, much slower compared to when it's not, when there's no CMC in it. Because I think basically the reason why the SCOBY is formed is because it's under stress when the resources are used up, and because the CMC already has the cellulose in it, which is also material for the bacteria to eat in order to structure itself to create the SCOBY. It is much slower because it's not under stress. Because the kombucha only starts to build the skin when it's actually under stress, because the biopolymers burst out of the cell walls, and then it structures itself in order to create this wall, in order to protect itself. So when it's already preserved with the material that they don't need the stress, the formation goes much slower, and also very interesting how they work. The actual material so far is much sturdier from the just using of the SCOBY, but also very fragile. It is reminding me a little bit of like a dehydrated agar-agar that you can actually break into pieces. So yeah, I'm curious into to experimenting more with this material. Cellulose is also supposedly be the natural material, but because it is extracted through synthetic processes, it's the same material what we basically are trying to create in the SCOBY as in the films as well, which is the biocellulose, basically this biofilm. Yeah, and so I think the dialogue, I'm not sure if there is a symbiosis or desymbiosis between them, but there's definitely a dialogue between them. And this is what I'm exploring at the moment, to see this dialogue, because scientifically speaking, it's like you're putting in a material that the kombucha is supposed to create by itself. And if there is an additional source where it's the material that you're trying to produce, it's very interesting. Then how is this material produced that is otherwise producing anyways by itself? So I think this is also something that I use metaphorically in my work, to think of the body as a container of not just natural things, but also a mixture of synthetic materials that we ingest, and the dialogue between the natural gut microbiome and together with the synthetic world that we also ingest, and how this is reacting or acting in the actual world. Are we becoming immune to the synthetic world? Our bodies are also changing and creating, adapting also. So, like back in the times, we were not being able to digest milk, and then we learned to be able to integrate that in our diet, and to change, and our gut microbiome also is changed by it. So I would say that it's very interesting to think the future, like have speculative futures towards this living being as also a container, and yeah, like to further imagine this relationship that we also have with ourselves, and how we see our bodies, basically. Thinking about our landscapes and also land politics, like of space and the changing global climate change. Like we can, if you think of natural resources, they're very limited. And I mean, we have also created like science to be able to grow everything indoors and like be detached from the like extracting things from the nature in order to be able to produce in a global scale. And like in Turkey, not a lot of people can afford the natural material, because there is a lot of labor that is and time that is involved with it, as well as like the expertise of dealing with the land. But I think I can see it functioning in smaller communities where people have more ancestral knowledge about dealing with land. But if you think of the like more global scale, then we are thinking about also monoculturing of resources in order to like to produce for the mass, because we're constantly thinking of the industry of like, okay, like we specializing in one thing and then taking over the fields. But I think there is I can imagine that like the in a smaller scale of living in certain areas, this dynamic can be more sustainable compared to like thinking of a global scale of resources and use of resources. But at the same time, yeah, like we're adjusting to this synthetic world because we're constantly in it. Like there is not another way out. And I mean, I have to be honest that like also because of pandemic, our actual environment sterile, like it became way too sterilized that I started having different problems with my skin. Like I started having eczema and all these things, which I also had a fungal infection, and I think it's because my body was not ready to cope with this very sterile environment. So it started to be, according to like my theories of my own body, started to respond to the place, this new place, this new dimension that we're put in. So I think it's very interesting to see, like, because we eradicated almost everything that was already living in our environment by sterilizing everything. And that also killed good and the bad bacteria altogether. So how do we reintroduce these good microbes again into like also thinking about our domestic spaces, for instance? And I do like to create this dialogue also through this fermentation practice, or also like teach fermentation in order to think of this thinking of like what are we sharing and how this kind of builds a community, because a lot of the most of the things that in order to get into the shelves are most often sterilized in order to be able to sold on the shelves. So otherwise, you know, kombucha would explode, or maybe you find traces of the good yeast and bacteria that you want in the drinks or the food, but most of the times they are either moisturized or heat treated, UV treated, in order to make it safe for everyone. So if you think of a bigger scale, the bigger scale always deals with standardization. And I think the only way to stay away from the standardization is to be able to create smaller communities where things are exchanged. But it also creates if I'm trying to think from, like, I try to also see the human body as like a different thing. Like I'm kind of somehow also thinking of like the God's microbiomes of many that are inside human form, but their dialogue also basically is what lives, which this is also something like I was fictionally creating, is that I'm not trying to promote the kombucha is the bacteria that is taking shape in my gut microbiome that is taking over my body to promote themselves to be spread. And so my sharing also was not about like, oh, this is a probiotic drink that you should drink, it is good for you, but also there is this something like a very intimate relationship between like the sharing of the microbiotic community, because we don't really think so deep, but it is something that lives with me and in my environment. So, you know, like if you would be drinking this, you would be also drinking a part that is taking shape in my own microbiome. And that also creates a different dialogue between you and me, because you become part of me by ingesting something that lives with me. So then if we think of smaller communities where everybody is ingesting each other's landscapes, then we're also growing a certain immunity to a certain landscape we're building all together. So then what is seen as the other in this context, or like what is accepted in and what is not rejected. So I think this is also very interesting to think of a totality, or like kind of like building these kind of community microbiomes where it also starts with continues with the question of like, I'm ingesting your house, I'm ingesting part of your story in my gut microbiome, which is digested and transferred back to another person. So it's not just something that lives with you, it's something that transfers to another body and to another body. So I think, and then, you know, as long as I'm immune to my domestic space, and I become also immune to your domestic space, your domestic space becomes my domestic space, my domestic gut microbiome, then to the other. So you create this diversity of different immunities towards like the landscape. We're trying to create the internal landscape of this outer landscape going into the internal landscape, and therefore to another landscape of the internal body of somebody else. Yeah, so it's like quite intimate. So I think, going back to your question of like of the CMC and the dialogue of this material is just as real as it gets into accepting the factor that this has become part of our future. Because to be honest, like you know, as much as I love wild foraging, I would like to do it with people, which is more rare to find these days, with people who have observed that landscape and know everything about that landscape for a really long time, because the human also carries a history of the places that they're settled. Like I was in Suriname and there was this guy who was talking about a tree that was there for 14 years, and he would observe everything that goes around that tree. So he would be able to archive everything that this tree had to go through. So I think people who are more receptive or like have this knowledge within a certain practice and fascination, they carry the story of that landscape. But nowadays, like, you know, if I see a mushroom under this tree or something and that looks edible, you know, this is a problem since also the pandemic. We are trying to reconnect back to the actual landscape. Don't know if it is safe. I don't know if folks peed on it, peed over the grass that I want to pick from the street. I wanted to use grass from our lawn, from my house when I was living in Brussels to make fermentation, and my housemates say, no, there's foxes running around everywhere and they pee everywhere, so it's poisonous, you cannot. And then I have to sterilize it in order to be able to even think about using it. And then it's not just about also me making something, but I'm also responsible, not just myself, but also who I would give that to. So if I have to think of the global, like bigger scale of hygienic sanitary conditions, I would also have to think about this factor, that I take responsibility also. So yeah, I'm as much as I would like to meet older people who are settled in places to get to know about that landscape through them, I don't trust so much the information of wild foraging without much knowledge, because there is a whole bunch of other ecosystems that are also growing around. There's so much factors to if you can pick something or not. It's so this is also something that I've been questioning a lot about wild and wild foraging, yeah. Because you can also do it completely wrong and then kill that species, and then you let something else grow there, and you know, there's a lot of things to consider. It's not just wild. Wild is not there. It has a memory, and this memory is carried by the human observing this landscape. So I think I would like to chase this kind of stories from like older generation that are vanishing. Yeah.